All right. Last 2 weeks we have focused on how we are called to do ministry, and we really emphasized how every single one of us are called to do ministry. We are all called to reach out. We are all called to spread the gospel. We are all called to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. And so I want to follow up this week by talking about the role of leadership in the church, but also how it relates to you. And so, thinking about last week, we talked about the freedom that we have. I believe it was last week. My weeks are running together. We talked about the freedom that we have in the United States. And interesting that I'm opening up this week, kind of still talking about the United States in terms of the Constitution is the foundational document of the United States. The Constitution provides the why behind the what we do and gives us insight into how we are structured. And I was reading this past week about Ephesians because we read through Ephesians this past week as a church, and I was interested to find out that many commentators view Ephesians as almost like the constitutional document for the church. Paul gives us insight into how the church is spiritually structured, and it is, in Paul's opinion, the best way to think about church. And so when you read through, I listened to Ephesians twice, actually, all the way through on my phone. I was listening to it, and I can see exactly how it's kind of like a constitution, the way that it's laid out and the way that it's structured. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, we get to where Paul emphasizes the importance of unity within the body of Christ. Then he begins to talk about how God has given gifts to the members of the church. And that's where we've been the last couple of weeks on how we're all gifted to serve a specific purpose within the church. But then in verse 11, he begins to discuss the leaders that he has given to the church. Ephesians 4:11 says this, "Now these are the gifts Christ gave to the church, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers." Notice that Paul says that these are the gifts that Jesus has given to the church. These are gifts that Christ has given. And I think that's interesting to think about those five set of leaders, those five roles that leaders fulfill, how these are gifts that Jesus has given to the church. Yet, I think we have reduced leadership in the church to basically the pastor and the teacher role. And evangelists appear occasionally. Revivals are not much of a thing anymore, but you often would hear of evangelists doing revivals. I think about Billy Graham, who was a great evangelist, who spread the gospel. But the apostles and prophets, that's completely gone, basically. You've probably been taught that the apostles and prophets only appeared in the first century church. And I'm not necessarily going to disagree with that. I kind of agree with that. I think the offices of the apostles and prophets probably ended at the end of the first century church. However, I do believe these giftings and roles are still active in the church today, or at least they should be. I'm not sure they are in terms of in practice, but I think they're needed, and I think a better understanding of these roles will help the church live out the calling that God has placed on our life. So I read a book about a year and a half ago, probably, called 5Q. And in that book, he spends the whole book talking about these five roles or these five offices in the church. And so I'm going to take some stuff that I learned from that book and teach it today. Just to be honest with you, I don't know if I agree with everything in the book, but I'm teaching to you parts that I think I do agree with and parts that I do think are applicable and that we need to apply to our church. And it gives you insight into some of the ways that I think and some of the ways that our leadership operates. So we're going to talk about these five different gifts or these five different roles in two ways. The first way is functions of the church. Because each role, each office represents a way that the church should function. And so we're going to talk about what that specific role represents, I guess you could say, in terms of how the church should function. And then we're going to talk about the gifts that characterize these different roles. And then I also want you to think about, in terms of the language that Paul used, that these are gifts that Christ has given the church. So think about that these 5 different roles or 5 different callings that people can have on their life, but they each bring something to the church. They each bring a gifting. They each gift something to the church to help the church function the way that it's intended to function. So we're going to go through all 5 of these, and we're going to talk about all 5. And we're going to talk about what happens when one becomes dominant. We're going to talk about what happens when some of them are missing, and we're going to talk about what each role looks like. And I'm going to explain it to you in my language and in just basically my summarized form rather than going into the detail. But that handout that you should have received in your email goes into detail for you about what else these functions do, what else these roles do, and it talks about it in the function sense and in the calling sense. But today during the sermon, I'm going to go through all 5 here. So the first one is the apostle. And when we think about apostle, we automatically think about Paul, Peter, the early church. We talked about a few weeks ago in one of our Bible studies about how apostle means the sent one. It means they are sent. And so the apostolic function within the church seeks to maintain and develop the sentness of the church. So the church is always meant to be sent into all the world. Jesus gave that instructions to the apostles, to the disciples, but that instruction is for us as well. We are sent. We are sent on a mission to do God's work in the world to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the apostolic function represents that within the church. And another way of thinking about it is the apostolic function seeks to extend Christianity and maintain forward movement around the core mission of making disciples. So the apostolic function always seeks to move the church forward into what God calls us to do. The gifts that this person would give to the church, this is someone that has this calling is great at seeing the big picture purpose of organization. They are good at casting vision, good at receiving vision from God and casting it to the church, giving long-term plans, because that's, once again, moving the church forward. It's reminding the church of their sentness, how we are called to reach people. This person is great at organizing systems within the church that helps the church move forward. This person will always be looking for ways to improve the church while staying true to the core values of what the church was supposed to be about in the first place. Some examples of people who I believe were apostles or had the apostolic gifting in their life. I immediately think about John Wesley. In fact, he was used as an example in the book. John Wesley reformed the church and created this system of discipleship that we're still replicating today. John Wesley created this system where you had your church services, and then you had your small groups, and then you had your what we call our discipleship groups. He created that system, and it really helped people grow closer to Jesus. And the Methodist movement grew at such a rapid pace. More modern day people who may be apostles, modern day apostles, church planners. I'm thinking about one of them that interviewed me for my church planner assessment. He has planted, I think it was like 15 churches. And I was thinking, man, he's a modern day apostle. He is reminded of the sentness of the church. And just other examples of thinking about people who would have this gifting is people who are great at setting up systems. And when I talk about systems, it's the structure within the church. They're great at organizing things. We need this. I believe this function and this gifting is missing in the church today. I think this role is missing in the church today, and I think it's needed. And I think we have people in our churches that have this gifting. We just got to release them to serve, and we got to help them grow in their gifting. So the apostolic function, just a quick summary, in the way I think about it, is that they see the big picture, they set up systems, and they keep the church moving forward into whatever God desires for them to do. So that's the apostolic function. The second one is the prophet. The prophet role, thinking about prophets of the Old Testament, they constantly called for Israel to remain faithful to God and to live holy among one another. The prophetic function of the church seeks to call people into a closer relationship with God and a healthy relationship with other people. So the prophets of the Old Testament constantly was calling people to grow closer to God, and the prophets of the New Testament are doing the same thing. I think there's modern day prophets who are doing this same thing, who have this prophetic bent to calling people in a deeper relationship with Jesus and calling people to live holy lives with one another. The church, that's really what part of our calling is, to bring people into a closer relationship with Jesus Christ. And so the prophetic role represents that function within the church. Also, the prophetic function also goes along with being concerned for what I call the least of these, being concerned for the oppressed. The church should be calling for justice to be done, for social justice to be done, maybe not in the way that the world defines it, but in the way that Jesus defines it. We should always be looking to help and love other people. And so the prophetic function, the prophetic role, represents how the church is meant to function as a prophetic voice in the world, calling people to treat each other right, but ultimately to love God. And so someone that aligns with this gifting in the church will constantly call for the people of God to live holy lives. A prophetic person will show lots of mercy and care to those who are less fortunate. And a prophetic person, I would say, they are normally very aware of what's going on in the spiritual realm. They are able to discern, they're able to know to the best of their ability what God desires. And the prophetic people are needed in the church today. I think the prophetic people are needed in the church today more than ever. I said on Friday night that the church has to be holy. If we ever want to see a revival break out, the church is going to have to be holy, set apart people. The prophetic person, the person who is gifted in this role, is constantly calling for people to go deeper in their relationship with Jesus. Some examples I'm thinking of is Martin Luther King Jr. He called for the end of segregation, the end of the racism, and he had a concern for other people. Other people I'm thinking about in our modern day church. These are people who are very focused on discipleship and bringing people closer to God. And it's also many people who have a heart for outreach. They have a concern for those that are less fortunate than us. And in particular, I would say it's people who have a concern for people who are addicted to things in the world. They want to help them grow closer to God. And so they do whatever they can to bring them out of that. That's a person that fits that prophetic role. So when I think about a prophet in the church or someone that aligns with this role, I think about someone that loves the truth and seeks to lead people to obey the truth and to bring people closer in their relationship with God. And so there's some people in our church that are just more bent towards discipleship. There's people in our church who are more bent towards holy living in terms of really pushing that on other people. And I would say those people align with the prophetic group. And that's needed because if we get too much into the evangelist role, and we're going to see that here in a little bit, then we don't become rooted. The prophetic person keeps us rooted. The evangelism role keeps us looking outward to other people, while the apostolic role keeps us moving. So we're going to get into all that. Let's go to the evangelists. The evangelists, thinking about evangelists, their primary focus is on spreading the gospel to as many people as possible. And so what that represents in the church is we should always be looking to get the gospel message out into the world. We should always be looking to get the message out and to try to seek a positive response in return. We should always be seeking to bring people to a knowledge of Jesus Christ and to salvation through him. The evangelism function of the church is primarily focused on communicating and connecting with those outside the church. So it may not be purely a gospel message every time. It might be something as simple as providing them food and connecting with them. There are certain people who thrive at talking with people outside the church. I am not one of them. I can do it, but I don't enjoy doing it. It drains me. But there's certain people that just love it and who thrive in that role. These are people who will go with that evangelism role. But the church is always meant to be looking outward and to always be looking to bring people into saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so we need this function. We need people who serve in this role in the church to keep us focused looking outward. And so a person that is gifted in this role is going to be someone who's easy to talk to, and they probably have a charismatic personality. People just want to be around them. They're probably going to be outgoing, and they're going to be willing to talk to just about anyone. And they're great at connecting with people, and they're generally positive people. We have some of these in our church, and I'm thankful for them because this is probably the one that I am least gifted at. And I know that when we started our church, we were missing that to some degree. We had someone that filled this role and filled it perfectly. They were very good at going up to a complete stranger and inviting them to church. And I get so nervous if I have to do that. But they're great at connecting with people, and I'm thankful that we have people in our church today that are still like that. And because you guys are serving in those roles, I believe so many people at our outreach events, at anything we do with the community, they feel our love because you are serving in this role. You are fulfilling this role within the church. Examples, the first one that comes to mind is Billy Graham. He was definitely an evangelist. He was charismatic. He was a great speaker. People really wanted to be around him. He was great at talking to people. Once again, in the church today, it's definitely people in the church that thrive when we do things for the community, and it's people who are naturally outgoing and contagious to be around. We just love being around them. And so just a summary of the evangelist role, they're focused outward. They are looking to bring people into the church. They're looking to spread the gospel to other people. And they thrive when in the community and talking with people who are really not part of the church. They're great at communicating a message and bringing people into the church. And we need them just as much as we need the rest of them. The pastors or shepherds, depending on which version you read, you'll see some that refers to the pastors as shepherds and some of them that refers to the shepherds as pastors. But this is one that most people agree are still active today, which is why we call the leaders of our church pastors, because most people believe that these are the only ones that are really still active today. But the responsibility of a shepherd is obviously to protect the flock, to guide the flock, to keep the flock safe. And so the pastoral function, this role represents how the church is meant to function in a way that protects the people of the church from disunity or false teachings, and to build these social connections within the church and to build a healthy body of believers. The shepherding, pastoring function in the church builds that family dynamic that we all love about our church and about any church really, where we're coming from different blood families, but yet we are all still a part of the family of God. And this pastoral or shepherding function builds that into the church and helps that to grow in greater ways than the other functions do, really. Someone that has this calling are going to be great at building community within the church. They're going to be protectors of the body of Christ, and they're going to cultivate a loving community of believers that people want to be a part of. So they're going to be like glue people. That's the way I think about them. They're going to be the ones that when they show up, the party shows up. They build those connections, those social bonds that keep us close to one another. But they're also the ones that are protectors. When they sense this unity in the church, they're going to do everything they can to bring peace and reconciliation to that situation. And so when I think about examples, I believe there are many pastors that are gifted in this area, especially in this particular, in Randolph County. I think many pastors are geared towards this. And one thing that I definitely see is that when pastors are geared towards this in this area anyway, people love that. That's what they think. They love the pastor that's going to make the hospital visit. They love the pastor that's going to be there anytime something goes wrong. They love the people that are going to be there, and that they thrive off of that. They are energized by that. They love caring for people. They love bringing food to people's houses. They love making sure that you are taken care of. And so when I think about people in the church, these are people in the church who are encouraging, easy to talk to, and they just build these social connections. These are people who are always looking for ways to maintain unity within the church. Our church is filled with people like this as well. And this is probably my second weakest, so I'm so thankful for that. Thankful that we have people in our church who do that and are great at doing that and great at making people feel loved and wanted, because that's needed in the church. And then finally, the last one is teachers. And some of y'all have been surprised that you got teachers as the results of your test or quiz. But let me explain it to you, because I don't want you to think about it in terms of just in the modern form of teacher. But the teaching function within the church is primarily focused on bringing wisdom and understanding to the congregation. So the church, part of making disciples is making sure our disciples understand as Christianity, make sure they understand as much as they can about God, make sure they understand what the Bible says. And so the teaching function, the teacher role represents how the church should teach our people, should bring this wisdom and knowledge and understanding to the congregation. The teaching function helps develop a biblical worldview and helps maintain a high level of maturity within the church. The teaching function seeks to connect the scriptures to people's everyday lives. So we're trying to take the scriptures and we're trying to communicate it to you in a way that you can understand, in a way that you can apply to your life today. That's what the church is. Many people think that's one of the main things the church is here for, and I would agree with that, because I think it's part of making disciples. But I also think you need the other four roles as well as part of making disciples. And I think we've been missing a few. But people who have this calling, they love to teach. A lot of them love to teach, but also they love gaining knowledge. They are focused on helping people gain greater knowledge of what God desires and what the scriptures teach. And they want to see people grow closer to God. Some of you that's been scoring high on teaching is interesting, because during our Bible reading, some of you that are scoring high are the ones that have also talked about how much they have loved reading their Bible. And they have loved gaining this knowledge that they never had before. And so it doesn't surprise me that you scored high in this teaching role, because I think we have teachers in the church that people that align with this role that might not necessarily be on that actually teaching other people, but you love studying the Word and gaining knowledge. And then you don't realize it, but you're teaching people in our small groups. You're teaching people when you speak up during our Bible studies. You're teaching other people. I've heard from other people in the church talking about your different groups that are meeting through the week, about how much you're learning from the other people in the church. And it's not necessarily coming from the quote unquote teacher. It's not coming from the group leader. It's coming from other people in the group. And I love that. And it's people who are aligned in this teaching role, who have this knowledge, who love gaining this knowledge, and then they help people apply it to their life. We have a lot of people in our church that align with this role, so that's good. I also think many pastors in the area align with this role. I think professors align with this role. And it's people who just have a lot of knowledge and love sharing that knowledge with others. So in my opinion, we shouldn't just throw this verse out like I think many people, many churches have. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, every church needs to have at least one person who is wired to one of these 5 roles present within the leadership structure of the church. I'm not saying that we need to start calling people apostles and prophets, evangelists, and teachers. But I'm saying that we need to have someone, and whether this is on, in the Wesleyan Church, we would say this is on our board. In a Baptist church, I would say that you need to have a deacon that aligns with one of these 5 roles. If the pastor thrives as a pastor in that shepherding role, then you need to have a deacon that's great at setting up systems. You need to have setting up structure within the church. You need to have a deacon that is great at pushing people into a closer relationship with Jesus. You need to have a deacon that is great at keeping the church focused, looking outward. And you need to have a deacon that loves to gain knowledge. And so I believe that we need to have, every church needs to have at least one person who is wired to one of these 5 present within their leadership structure. Because I believe our churches are filled with people who are gifted in these areas. And so what we as a church have to do, we just need to identify these people and help them grow in their gifts and allow them to lead where they are gifted. And that's key. So often we place people where they're not gifted. We need to identify these people within the church and allow them to lead where they are gifted. And so what is the purpose of these 5 gifts to the church? Well, Paul continues in Ephesians 4:12. He says their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and to build up the church, the body of Christ. So these 5 roles in the church, their responsibility is to equip, not to do the work, not to do all the teaching, not to do all the pastoring, not to do all the hospital visits, not to do everything in the church. Their job is to equip God's people to do his work and to build up the church. It was never meant for the professionals to do all the work in the church. The leaders are actually meant to equip or give you everything you need to do the work that God has called you to do. That's what we are trying to do in our church. That's what we've talked about these last few weeks, of how you are called to be the church. It's my job, it's our leaders' jobs to equip you with everything you need to do what God has led you to do. And I think that what we'll see is the result here in Ephesians 4:13. Paul says this, if we do this, this will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son, that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. This will continue. So he says this will continue until we all come to such unity. I don't know about you, but we need more unity in the church. And this is unity in our faith and unity in knowledge of who God's Son is. And then he tells us that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. I don't know about you, but I love that. I think our churches are missing this level of maturity, because then Paul goes into talking about how you're going to be no longer like infants who are tossed to and fro with the wind, with all these teachings that lead you astray. We need mature people in the church. And I wonder if one reason why we don't have mature believers in the church is because we've not been allowing these 5 roles to lead in the church. we're missing some portions of what God has called the church to be. Even going back to Ephesians 4:12, you are called to build up the church, the body of Christ. The leader's job is to equip you to build up the church. I would love to see the church be built up more and more in Seagrove. I would love for us to see more and more of people becoming followers of Jesus. I would love to see us continue to take people away from the kingdom of the world and from the prince of this world, and to give them the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And I believe that having these 5 roles active in the church is a key to doing that. But it also we need to make sure that you understand your calling as part of the church as well. How you are called to actually build up the church and do the work. And so I believe that the church has been operating with 2 and sometimes 3 expressions of the leadership that God has given the church, which is one reason why many of our churches are in such bad shape. We are operating without all the gifts present within the church. I was talking to some people the other day, and they were telling me about their church, and they were talking about how they basically been doing the same old thing for 20, 30 years, saying that they hear about what we're doing at our church, and they said, what are we doing in our community? What are we doing to help our community? And they were talking about how they have all these committees, how these things within the church, and yet not much gets accomplished. And I was going back to thinking they're missing, they're missing that prophetic, and they're missing that evangelism role within the church. Because one thing they said our church is great at loving people in the church, but we never really look outside of the church. And that's the evangelism function that's needed. That's the evangelism role that's needed in the church. They talk about how they're still dealing with immature Christians. That's the prophetic function that needs to take place in the church. That's the prophetic role that needs to push people into a closer relationship with God. And then the apostolic needs the church to continue moving forward. And so that leads into discussion of what happens when one gifting becomes dominant in the church. What happens when one of these 5 becomes dominant within a church, a dominant gift in the church? When it comes to the apostolic role, if that becomes dominant, then the organization can become a task-driven and demanding that no one wants to be part of. A lot of workplaces are like that. I know of some churches that are like that, where they basically have someone that's gifted as an apostle, but they demand so much from the church, and they want the system or the organization so smooth that no one wants to work for them. No one wants to be a part of that church because it's so demanding and task driven. If the prophetic function becomes dominant, the community of believers can be a little out there sometimes. They can be overcritical, legalistic, and judgmental. So if there's people who's just constantly calling people into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ, and I'm thinking about the Wesleyan Church, we have come up with these rules. We have sets of things that you should and shouldn't do. And we came up with that with the right heart to bring people into a closer relationship with Jesus. And I think it's coming out of this prophetic gifting that many people in the Wesleyan Church probably had, yet it became dominant. It was not balanced with the evangelistic function, and so it became this overcritical, legalistic, and judgmental organization. And I think that there are plenty of churches around here that are like that. If the evangelistic function becomes dominant within the church can become very shallow and reflect more of the world than the church. If you ask me, we have a lot of churches like that today, where the focus is completely on the outside and there's no focus on discipling people in the church. So the prophetic is completely. I think we can flip overcritical, and judgmental and legalistic to not having any standards and to just constantly looking to add people to the church. You got to have a, which is why you need both of them. Yet I think we have left many of them behind. The pastoral, when the pastoral or shepherding dominant in the church becomes inwardly focused, cliquey, and exclusive. You have a strong set of believers in the church, and you have a strong family in the church, strong family dynamic. Yet, it's too inwardly focused to where the church doesn't grow, never looking to the outside. They become cliquey, and it's hard for anybody else to become a part of their church. And there's plenty of churches like this as well. And I think that this is probably the most dominant in our area because we have so many pastors that align in the church. And so because of that, these churches, they love what they've had. They love the people that are part of their church. And if they're being honest with themselves, they don't really want to add anyone else because they like how it is. And they enjoy it so much. I get it, but that's wrong. You need that evangelistic gifting, the evangelistic role to keep the church looking outward as it's balanced with the pastoral and the prophetic. And then, of course, the teaching. And the teaching and prophetic go kind of hand in hand. The church becomes legalistic, knowledge-focused, and over-intellectual to the point that no one wants to join. When a church is constantly, or when a pastor is constantly talking above everybody's head, no one wants to be a part of that. And so that's why you need someone that is gifted in that evangelism role and even that apostolic role to help someone realize, hey, we've got to talk to people on their level. We got to reach people with the gospel. We need to make sure that people can understand what's actually being taught. And so I believe that many of our churches have dominant pastoral and teaching functions within them. And so that because of that, the focus has turned inward rather than outward. And the focus is on gaining more knowledge, but not necessarily living that knowledge out in the world today. And because of that, many of our churches are dying. And as we look into Church 3.0, as we look into the church in the future, we need to make sure that we have all 5 expressions within the leadership structure of the church for the church to thrive. We have 6 members of our leadership, including myself, and we have tried to do that at Cornerstone. We have tried to identify people, at least I have tried to identify people in our church who are gifted in one of these 5 roles and bring them on to leadership. And I especially bring people on board in the areas that I'm least gifted in, which is, in my opinion, the evangelistic and the shepherding / pastoring. I just to give you insight into what mine are. On that test I took, the apostolic function is the highest, and then the teaching, and then the prophetic. And I can definitely see all 3 of those active in my life. And you can have more than one active in your life, and that's one reason why I like that quiz that you took, because it gives you, at the bottom of the page, it gives you what percentage you are of each one. But I believe because we have had these 5 expressions within the leadership structure of our church, I believe it has played a key role in the growth that we have experienced in our church. It enables everyone to serve where they are gifted, which enables them to thrive, which enables our church to thrive, and I believe it keeps our church as balanced as possible. As we have some that are more gifted at the shepherding, pastoring, or some that are more gifted at talking to people at our community events and community outreach. It keeps us balanced, and it keeps our church moving forward, and it keeps our church grounded. I believe in what Jesus desires for the church to be. And so, just as a reminder, it's our job as the leadership to equip you. And we spent 3 weeks talking about that. For the church to become all that God desires for it to become, it requires everyone living out their God-given purpose. And so one of the ways that I like to think about these 5 giftings and these 5 roles is that, and this is the premise of that 5Q book, is that everyone, and he includes non-Christians in this, everyone is wired towards one of these 5. And he argues that Jesus had all 5 of these roles, all 5 of these giftings active in his life to the highest level. And I agree with that. And then we're created in the image of God, and Jesus was God. So he argues in that book that we all are wired towards at least one of these, if not more. That is part of how God created you and how God gifted you. And so in your groups, and we're going to see if we can figure out when those groups can meet. Hopefully Zoom's going to be working again. In your groups, you're going to discuss the results of your assessment and talk about where you can serve in the church. And so if you've not taken that assessment, we can send it to you. We can get it to you. And then your group leader, whoever that is, will contact you about a time for y'all to get together and discuss which one of these you align with, which one of these that you are gifted in. And I believe that will help us determine and help us have a greater knowledge of where you are best fit to serve in the church. When I think about those who are great at that shepherding role, that pastoring role, we really want them involved in our table gatherings, building that family dynamic. We want them involved in our meals. We want them involved in any fellowship thing we do within the church. Those that are gifted in the prophetic, we want them definitely involved in our discipleship thinking process. We want them involved everything with discipleship because they're constantly looking to call people in a deeper relationship with Jesus. When I think about people who's in the apostolic, who are gifted in the apostolic function way, these are people that can start new ministries that can help us brainstorm the future of the church, what the church is going to look like, and it maintains that sentness within the church. The evangelistic obviously looks outward, looks at people outside the church. They're going to thrive in any setting we do within the community in the teaching role. These are people we want to help us develop outlines. These are people that we want us to help develop table gathering studies. These are people that we want to help us gain knowledge within the church so that we have a better understanding of what God has called us to do.